He was born into a world where men didn't apologize. They commanded. They owned. They erased their mistakes. Alessio Moretti was the only son of the most feared mafia boss in the country. By 26, he had everything waiting for him: the empire, the loyalty of hardened men, the power to bend entire cities to his will. And he believed that power made him untouchable, until the day a doctor looked him in the eye and said, "You will never walk again." The bullet that tore through his spine didn't just paralyze his legs, it exposed his past. Because the second sentence the doctor spoke was worse. "You will never have children." In that quiet hospital room, stripped of bodyguards, stripped of fear, stripped of the illusion of invincibility, Alessio remembered something he had buried years ago. A girl, a housemate in his father's mansion, soft-spoken, invisible, easy to overlook, easy to silence. He remembered the night he took what was never his to take. He remembered the trembling voice weeks later. "I'm pregnant." He remembered how insulted he felt, how furious, how he accused her of trying to trap him, and he remembered telling his father to make her disappear. By morning, she was gone, problem solved, or so he thought. Now, lying in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling he couldn't even stand beneath anymore, Alessio realized something that made his chest tighten, with something dangerously close to fear. There might be a son out there, his son, an heir he rejected, a child who had grown up without his name, his protection, his acknowledgement. And for the first time in his life, Alessio understood what it meant to lose control. Because the empire still belonged to him, the men still bowed, the city still feared him. But the one thing he now desperately needed, a legacy, a bloodline, a second chance, was walking somewhere in the world, without him, and the woman he once cast aside. She might be the only person powerful enough to deny him everything. This is the story of a man who had absolute power. And the day he discovered that power means nothing. When the people you hurt are no longer afraid of you. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from, and subscribe for more mind-blowing stories. The Moretti estate did not look like a crime empire. It looked like legacy. White marble columns, iron gates that opened without sound, gardens trimmed so precisely they seemed artificial. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung over polished floors that reflected every movement, as if even the house was watching. Alessio Moretti had grown up in those reflections. As a boy, he learned two things before he learned kindness. First, power is inherited. Second, weakness is eliminated. His father, Don Carlo Moretti, did not raise sons. He raised successors. At dinner, conversations were not about school or friends. They were about loyalty, betrayal, and discipline. "You are not like other men," Don Carlo would say, his voice calm but absolute. "Other men answer to someone. You do not." By 26, Alessio believed it. The guard stepped aside when he walked. The staff lowered their eyes. His word carried weight, even when it was careless, especially when it was careless. That was the environment Isabella stepped into. She arrived at the estate with one suitcase and a recommendation letter from a distant aunt who once worked in the kitchens. She was 19, quiet, and painfully aware that she did not belong among marble staircases and silk curtains. Her uniform was simple: black skirt, white blouse, hair tied back neatly. She kept her head down and her movements small. In a house like this, invisibility felt like protection. She scrubbed floors that cost more than her entire childhood apartment. She polished silverware engraved with the Moretti crest. She learned quickly which corridors to avoid and which doors never to knock on. And she learned something else. The sun watched, not always directly. Sometimes it was a shadow at the end of the hall, a presence behind her while she folded linens, a slow pause when she passed by carrying trays. Alessio had noticed her from the beginning, not because she was bold, because she wasn't. There was something about how carefully she moved, how she tried to shrink herself inside a house built for giants. It intrigued him in a way he couldn't immediately explain. He told himself it was harmless curiosity. He told himself he was simply observing. But Alessio had never been taught boundaries, only access. One evening, the estate hosted a gathering. Men in tailored suits filled the halls, laughter echoing too loudly over the clink of crystal glasses. Cigars burned slowly in silver trays. Deals were whispered in corners. Alessio drank more than he usually did, not because he needed it, because he liked the feeling of being untouchable. The night blurred into arrogance, into the echo of his father's approval, into the certainty that nothing in that house, no object, no space, no person, existed beyond the reach of his will. When the guests finally left, and the mansion fell quiet, Isabella was still working. She was in the upstairs corridor, collecting empty glasses from a side table. Her movements were slow with exhaustion. The hour was late enough that even the guards had relaxed. She didn't hear him approach, only the sound of his voice behind her. "You work too hard." She turned quickly, startled. "I'm just finishing up, sir." He didn't like that word. "Sir." It reminded him of distance. He stepped closer. "You don't have to be so afraid." But she wasn't afraid because of the job. She was afraid because she understood hierarchy. And hierarchy in the Moretti house meant that refusal did not exist in equal measure. The hallway felt narrower than it had minutes ago. His tone wasn't shouting. It wasn't violent. It was worse. It was confident. Confident in the belief that he would not be stopped. Confident in the belief that she had nowhere to go. And in that moment, Alessio made a choice. Not a mistake. A choice. One built on years of entitlement. One built on the idea that silence meant permission. When it was over, the corridor looked exactly the same. The paintings still hung perfectly straight. The chandeliers still shimmered. But something irreversible had happened. Isabella did not cry. Not there. She finished collecting the glasses. She walked back to her small room at the far end of the staff wing. She locked the door. And only then did she allow herself to shake. Downstairs, Alessio poured himself another drink. He did not feel guilt. He felt irritated. Irritated by the tension in the air. Irritated by the strange weight in his chest he refused to name. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself she would understand. He told himself power came with privileges. And the house remained silent. Because in the Moretti estate, silence was loyalty. Silence was protection. Silence was survival. But silence does not erase consequence. It only delays it. And somewhere inside that quiet mansion, and beneath marble and chandeliers and inherited arrogance, the future had just shifted. Neither of them knew it yet. But that hallway would one day become the beginning of Alessio Moretti's downfall, and the birth of something he could never control. The mansion returned to routine, as if nothing had shifted. Breakfast was served at 7. Meetings began at 9. Orders were given. Deals were signed. Silence did its job. Isabella moved through the halls the way she always had. Quiet, efficient, unseen. If Alessio noticed the way her eyes no longer lifted when he entered a room, he didn't comment on it. If he sensed the stiffness in her posture, he dismissed it as discomfort. Weeks passed. Then her body began to betray her. It started with nausea. Sudden waves that forced her to grip the edge of a sink until her knuckles turned white. Then dizziness. Then exhaustion so heavy she could barely climb the narrow staircase to the staff quarters. She counted days in her head at night, then counted again. Then stopped counting because the numbers made her chest tighten. She bought a test with money she had been saving to send home to her aunt. She took it in the small bathroom at the back of the estate, hands trembling so hard she nearly dropped it. 2 lines, clear, unforgiving. For a long time, she just stared. The marble floors upstairs gleamed under chandeliers worth more than her entire life. In the staff wing, the fluorescent light flickered slightly, buzzing like it knew something irreversible had happened. She sat on the edge of the bathtub and pressed her palm against her stomach. She was 19. She had no savings, no protection, and the father of her child was the most powerful young man in the house. For days, she said nothing. She considered leaving quietly, disappearing before her body made the decision obvious. But fear is complicated when pride is involved. She didn't want money thrown at her. She didn't want to be treated like a scandal. And somewhere deep down, she believed, foolishly, desperately, that telling him was the right thing. That truth might spark something human in him. So one evening, when the house was quieter than usual, she knocked on his office door. Alessio didn't look up immediately. He was reviewing paperwork, jaw set, a glass of whiskey resting near his hand. "Yes?" Her voice felt too small in the room. "I need to speak with you." He leaned back in his chair, irritation flickering across his face. "Make it quick." She stepped inside, closed the door. The click echoed louder than she expected. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was not shock. It was calculation. Alessio stared at her, expression flattening as if she'd just announced a minor inconvenience. "That's impossible." "It isn't." A muscle in his jaw tightened. He stood slowly, circling his desk like he was assessing a business proposal. "You expect me to believe that?" Her throat burned, but she didn't look away. "It's yours." The room changed, not physically, but emotionally. Something sharp entered the air. "You think you can trap me with this?" His voice dropped, controlled, but edged. "You think I'm stupid?" "I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. "I just thought you should know." "Should know." He laughed once, short and humorless. "You thought I'd what? Celebrate?" His pride was louder than his logic. He didn't see fear in her face. He saw threat. Threat to reputation. Threat to control. Threat to the image his father had built. "You will not use my name to elevate yourself," he said coldly. Her hands clenched at her sides. "I don't want your name." That answer unsettled him more than tears would have. If she had begged, he could have dismissed her. If she had demanded money, he could have bought silence. But she stood there with nothing but truth, and truth made him feel cornered. He grabbed his phone. "Leave," he said without looking at her. "I'll handle it." She stood still for a moment, as if waiting for something. An apology, a flicker of responsibility, a crack in his armor. Nothing came. She left the office quietly, down the hall, down the staircase, back to the staff wing. Her hands trembled, but her spine remained straight. Upstairs, Alessio dialed his father. Don Carlo listened without interrupting. When Alessio finished, there was a pause. Then his father spoke. "You were careless." The words stung more than Alessio expected. "But mistakes are corrected." "How?" Alessio asked. Don Carlo's tone didn't change. "Remove the problem." No outrage, no moral lecture, no concern for the girl, just efficiency. By morning, 2 men in suits stood outside Isabella's small room. They handed her an envelope. Cash. More money than she had ever held at once. "You'll be relocated," one of them said, quietly. "And if I refuse?" she asked. The man didn't raise his voice. "You won't." They gave her until sunset. No chance to speak to anyone. No chance to gather more than her suitcase. When she stepped outside the gates of the Moretti estate that evening, the iron doors closed behind her with mechanical indifference. Upstairs, Alessio watched from a window. He told himself it was necessary. Cleaner this way. No scandal. No weakness. No distraction. He poured himself a drink. By the next day, her room had been cleared. Sheets replaced. Closet emptied. Presents erased. The house returned to silence. And Alessio believed the problem was solved. But somewhere miles away, on a bus heading toward a city that didn't know her name, a 19-year-old girl pressed a shaking hand against her stomach and whispered to the life inside her, "You will not be erased." Alessio thought he had protected his future. He had no idea he had just abandoned it. The city Isabella moved to did not care who she had been. It didn't care about marble staircases or iron gates or the name Moretti. It cared about rent, about bus schedules, about whether you could pay for groceries before the market closed. She rented a small apartment above a laundromat. The walls were thin, the plumbing loud, the windows cracked at the corners. It was nothing like the estate she had left behind. And yet, for the first time in months, she could breathe. When her son was born, the hospital room was quiet. No bodyguards, no powerful surname waiting to claim him. Just a tired nurse, the hum of fluorescent lights, and Isabella gripping the rails of the bed as pain split her in two. When she finally heard him cry, something inside her shifted. Not fear, not shame. Fierce, protective love. She held him against her chest and whispered his name. Luca. She chose it carefully. Not after his father. Not after any legacy of power. Just Luca. Because she wanted his life to belong to him. The first year was survival. She worked mornings at a bakery, evenings cleaning office buildings. She learned how to sleep in fragments, 40 minutes at a time. She learned how to stretch money so thin it almost disappeared. There were nights she cried quietly while Luca slept in a second-hand crib beside her bed. But she never cried in front of him, because she refused to let him inherit fear. As he grew, she noticed the similarities. The shape of his eyes, the sharpness in his gaze, the way he studied people before speaking. It unsettled her sometimes, not because he resembled Alessio physically, but because she feared the world might try to shape him the same way. So she taught him differently. Strength isn't about being feared, she would say, while tying his shoes before school. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. He listened. He asked questions. Did I have a dad? The first time he asked, he was 4. Isabella's hands paused mid-motion. You do, she answered carefully. Where is he? She looked into her son's eyes, the same shade as the man who had once dismissed her. He made choices, she said, and sometimes choices mean you don't get to stay. Luca nodded, as if that made sense. Children accept what adults complicate. Meanwhile, miles away, Alessio was becoming exactly what his father had trained him to be: ruthless, precise, unemotional. When Don Carlo died of a sudden heart attack, the empire didn't falter. It simply shifted. Alessio took the throne without hesitation. He stood at the head of the long oak table in the estate's private conference room and announced changes, expansions, restructurings, alliances. The men around him respected him, but they did not love him. Fear kept them loyal, and Alessio believed fear was enough. He never married. He never allowed anyone close enough to question him. When older associates hinted at securing his legacy, finding a suitable wife from a powerful family, he brushed them off. There's time, he would say. He believed time belonged to him. He believed the past had been buried with the silence of the estate. But silence does not disappear. It waits. Years passed. Luca turned 8. He was smaller than some boys his age, but quicker in thought. He stood up for classmates who were bullied. He came home once with a split lip because he had stepped between 2 older boys and a kid half their size. When Isabella saw the bruise, her chest tightened. Why didn't you just walk away? Luca shrugged. Because he couldn't. The simplicity of it brought tears to her eyes. That night, after he fell asleep, she sat at the edge of his bed and watched him breathe. He had inherited his father's eyes, but he had not inherited his father's entitlement, and that was the difference. Back at the estate, Alessio rarely thought about the girl he had sent away. When he did, it was fleeting, a flicker of memory that he pushed aside. He told himself if a child had existed, someone would have reached out. Someone would have demanded money. Silence, in his mind, meant absence. And absence meant problem solved. He didn't know that the absence was deliberate, that Isabella had chosen distance over confrontation, that she had chosen dignity over dependency. One afternoon, during a routine security briefing, one of his advisors mentioned succession again. You're not getting younger, the man said cautiously. The family needs certainty. Alessio dismissed him with a wave of his hand. I'll handle it. But that night, alone in his father's old office, he found himself staring at a framed photo on the desk. Don Carlo stood tall, hand resting firmly on young Alessio's shoulder. Legacy. inheritance, expectation. For the first time in years, Alessio felt something unfamiliar. Not guilt, not yet. Just curiosity. A question he had buried resurfaced. What if the problem had not been erased? What if somewhere, and beyond his control, a part of him existed? He pushed the thought away. He always had. But outside the estate, in a small apartment above a laundromat, a boy with his eyes was finishing homework at a kitchen table. And every day that passed, the distance between father and son grew wider. Not in miles, in character. Alessio believed he had protected his future. He had no idea that his real legacy was being shaped, without his name, without his power, and without his permission. Power feels permanent, until the moment it isn't. By the time Alessio turned 32, the Moretti Empire had expanded beyond what even his father had envisioned. New alliances, cleaner fronts, fewer public scandals. He had sharpened the family's image into something modern and untouchable. He moved like a man who believed destiny was guaranteed. The estate was quieter now, less laughter, more strategy. He preferred it that way. Control had a sound, and it sounded like silence. But rivals don't fear silence. They study it. The attack happened on a rainy Thursday evening. Alessio had just left a private meeting in the city, an underground parking structure beneath a luxury hotel. 2 bodyguards walked ahead of him, 1 behind. Routine, predictable, safe. The first shot echoed like a door slamming in a cathedral. Then another. Then chaos. 1 guard dropped instantly. The other returned fire, shouting orders. Alessio didn't run. He turned, instinctively reaching for control. And that was when the bullet found him. A violent force slammed into his back. He felt heat first, then numbness, then something worse. Nothing. He hit the ground hard, breath stolen from his lungs. The concrete smelled like oil and rain. He tried to stand. His legs didn't respond. The world above him blurred into flashing lights and shouting voices. The gunfire faded. Sirens replaced it. Alessio lay there, staring at the gray ceiling of the garage, rainwater trickling near his cheek. He had always believed pain would feel dramatic. Instead, it felt distant, cold, like something already lost. He woke up in a private hospital suite surrounded by machines. The air smelled sterile. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in pale morning light. His men stood outside the door. Inside, there was only a doctor. "Mr. Moretti," the doctor said carefully, hands folded. Alessio tried to sit up. Nothing below his waist moved. The doctor's voice remained steady. "The bullet severely damaged your spinal cord. We performed emergency surgery, but..." The word echoed louder than gunfire. "You will not regain mobility in your lower body." Silence. Alessio stared at him, as if staring long enough might reverse the sentence. "I have the best surgeons in the country," he said flatly. "Yes," the doctor replied gently, "and they all agree." The room felt smaller. For the first time in his life, no one in the room was afraid of him. And then came the second sentence. "We also need to discuss another consequence of the injury." The doctor hesitated. "The trauma has left you unable to father children." That one landed deeper. Not in his spine, in his chest. The doctor continued speaking. Statistics, probabilities, alternative procedures. Alessio heard none of it. Children. He had never prioritized them, never thought he needed them. But now that the option was gone, it felt like something had been stolen. The empire still existed. His men still waited outside. His name still carried weight. But legacy? Legacy had just slipped beyond his reach. Recovery was slow, painful, humiliating. He hated needing assistance, hated the chair, hated the way the world now existed at eye level instead of above him. The estate had ramps installed within weeks. Meetings resumed, operations continued. But something had shifted. Whispers circulated. Enemies watched more closely. And at night, when the halls were silent again, Alessio lay awake staring at the ceiling of the master suite. And for the first time in years, he remembered her. Not as a problem. not as a threat, but as possibility. He remembered her voice in his office. "I'm pregnant." He had felt insulted then. Now the memory felt like accusation. If she had told the truth, if the child had existed, he had already had an heir, a son who carried his blood, a future that didn't depend on his body, and he had erased it, not because he didn't want a child, but because he couldn't tolerate responsibility. The thought refused to leave. Days turned into weeks. The chair became permanent, and with permanence came clarity. For the first time, Alessio began to understand something his father had never taught him. Power is loud. Regret is quiet. It sits with you. It waits. It forces you to replay moments you thought were insignificant. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, he summoned his most trusted advisor. "I need you to find someone," Alessio said. The advisor hesitated. "Who?" He didn't answer immediately. He hadn't spoken her name in years. "Isabella." The name felt unfamiliar in his mouth. "There may be a child," he added quietly. The advisor studied him. "Should I bring them here?" Alessio looked out the window at the darkened estate grounds. "No," he said after a long pause. "Just find them." Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he had the right to summon anyone. Outside the gates of the Moretti estate, life continued without him. In a modest apartment across the city, a boy finished his homework at a kitchen table while his mother prepared dinner. He didn't know his father's name. He didn't know about empires. He didn't know that somewhere in a mansion built on fear, a man in a wheelchair was staring at the rain, and realizing that the one thing he truly needed was the one thing he had chosen to abandon. The throne hadn't been taken from him. It had simply become smaller. And now, for the first time, Alessio understood what it felt like to lose control. It took 3 months to find her. Alessio's men searched quietly. No threats, no loud movements, no reminders of the Moretti name, just records. A bakery job that ended 2 years ago. A rental agreement under a different surname. A school enrollment form for a boy named Luca Romano. Romano, not Moretti. Alessio stared at the file longer than he meant to. She hadn't used his name. She had chosen something else. Something free. The address led to a modest apartment in a neighborhood far from the polished skyline he owned, the kind of place his drivers usually passed without slowing down. He didn't bring guards inside. He didn't bring advisors. For once, he went alone. The wheelchair made everything slower, more deliberate. The sidewalk felt uneven beneath him, as if the city itself refused to smooth the path. When he reached the building, he paused, not from fear, from uncertainty. He had commanded rooms full of hardened men without hesitation, but knocking on that door felt heavier than any meeting he had ever chaired. He raised his hand. Knocked. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. Isabella stood there, older, steadier. The softness that once made her seem fragile had hardened into composure. Her eyes found his instantly. No shock, no trembling, just recognition. "You took your time," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't angry. It was measured. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words tangled in a way they never had before. "I needed to speak with you. You've had 9 years." The number landed like a verdict. 9 years, 9 birthdays, 9 winters, 9 chances he never took. A smaller voice called from inside the apartment. "Mom." Isabella didn't break eye contact. "Stay in your room, Luca," she called gently. The name pierced him. So it was true. The boy stepped into view anyway, curious, alert. He looked like a mirror from the past. Alessio's eyes, Alessio's jawline. But the way he stood was different. There was no entitlement in it, just awareness. "Who is he?" Luca asked. Isabella answered without hesitation. "He's someone who made a choice." Alessio swallowed. "I'm your father," he said carefully. The word father felt unfamiliar, almost undeserved. Luca didn't react dramatically. He didn't run forward. He didn't cry. He studied him. "You're the man who made my mom cry?" the boy asked. There was no accusation in his tone, just curiosity. And that simplicity hurt more than anger would have. Alessio glanced at Isabella. She didn't look away. She didn't protect him from the truth. "Yes," she said calmly. Silence stretched. The apartment was small. Worn sofa, chipped coffee table, school books stacked neatly in the corner. It wasn't a palace, but it felt alive, warm, real. Alessio realized something unsettling. His mansion had never felt like this. He turned back to Isabella. "I want to help," he said. "I can provide for him, education, security, a future." She stepped forward slightly, closing the space but not softening. "He already has a future. He deserves more." She shook her head. "He deserves peace." Her words weren't emotional. They were certain. "I'm not here to take him away," Alessio said quickly. "Then why are you here?" she asked. "Because I can't have another. Because I need an heir. Because I'm afraid of dying alone." The answers swirled inside him. But for the first time in his life, he didn't let the selfish ones speak first. "I'm here because I was wrong," he said quietly. The room absorbed the sentence. Isabella's expression didn't shift. "You were," she replied. No shouting, no tears, just acknowledgement. He continued. "I thought power meant I could erase my mistakes. I thought sending you away solved the problem." "And now?" she asked. "Now I understand that I erased myself." Her eyes flickered slightly at that. Luca moved closer to his mother. "If you're my dad," he said slowly, "why didn't you stay?" The question was simple, brutal, because there was no sophisticated answer. "I was afraid," Alessio admitted. The word tasted foreign. "Of what?" Luca asked. "Of responsibility." Isabella watched him carefully. Years ago, she would have flinched at his tone. Now she evaluated it, weighed it, measured whether it was performance or truth. "And what do you want now?" she asked. Alessio looked at the boy again. He saw himself, but better. Less hardened, less damaged. "I don't want to own him," he said. "I don't want to control him." He exhaled slowly. "I want the chance to earn something." Silence again, the kind that tests sincerity. Isabella folded her arms. "You don't get to rewrite the past," she said. "I know." "You don't get to use him as a symbol." "I won't." "You don't get to take him." He held her gaze. "I'm not here to take." That was the difference. Years ago he had taken. Without asking, without thinking, without consequence. Now, sitting lower than he ever had in his life, he realized something devastating. The only power he had left here was humility. Luca studied him for another long moment. Then he asked something unexpected. "Can you play chess?" Alessio blinked. "Yes." The boy shrugged. "Then maybe you can visit." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. It was possibility. Isabella looked at her son, then at the man in the wheelchair who once believed he ruled everything. "This happened slowly," she said firmly. "On my terms." Alessio nodded. For the first time in his life, he didn't negotiate, he didn't command, he accepted. Because hope, he realized, is not something you demand. It's something you're allowed to build. And for the first time, the most powerful man in the city understood that power meant nothing. If the people you hurt are no longer afraid of you. The first time Alessio returned, he brought nothing. No gifts, no envelopes, no promises written in legal ink. Just himself. It felt unnatural. His entire life had been built on transaction, loyalty for protection, silence for money, power for obedience. But Isabella had made it clear. This happened slowly, on my terms. So he came once a week, every Saturday at 4. The first visit lasted 20 minutes. Luca sat across from him at the small kitchen table, a worn chessboard between them. The pieces were mismatched, one rook from another set, a knight slightly chipped at the base. Alessio studied the board carefully. He had played chess in private schools, in back rooms with politicians, in strategy meetings disguised as friendly games. He had always been good at anticipating moves, but this game felt different. Luca wasn't aggressive, like he wasn't reckless. He was patient. He sacrificed pieces without panic, and when he finally cornered Alessio's king, he didn't smile. He just said, "Check." Alessio looked up at him. "You're careful," he observed. "My mom says rushing makes you sloppy." He nodded slowly. "Your mother is right." The second visit lasted longer. 35 minutes. They spoke about school, about math, about history. Luca liked stories about empires, not because of power, but because of collapse. "Every empire falls," he said casually, while moving a bishop across the board. Alessio held the piece in his fingers for a moment, before responding. "Yes," he said quietly. "Most of them do." Isabella stayed nearby during every visit, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes folding laundry, sometimes pretending not to listen. But she listened. She watched Alessio closely. She wasn't measuring his words. She was measuring consistency. It's easy to apologize once. It's harder to return, week after week, without control, without leverage, without demand. At the estate, whispers had begun. "You visit them every Saturday?" one advisor asked cautiously. "Yes." "It makes you look vulnerable." Alessio turned his wheelchair slightly, meeting the man's eyes. "Then perhaps vulnerability is necessary." The advisor didn't know how to respond. The old Alessio would have crushed that kind of comment. The new Alessio simply let it hang in the air. He began making changes in the empire quietly, less aggression, more legitimate fronts, a restructuring that reduced street violence. Some of the older captains resisted. "This isn't how your father ran things." "I'm not my father," Alessio replied calmly. That was true in more ways than one. One afternoon, after nearly 3 months of visits, Luca asked a question that shifted the air. "Why didn't you fight for me?" The chessboard sat untouched between them. Isabella froze in the hallway. Alessio didn't look away this time. "Because I didn't understand what I was losing," he said honestly. "And now you do?" "Yes." Luca considered that. "Mom says understanding something doesn't fix it." "She's right." Another long pause. "You can't fix what you did," Luca continued. "So what are you trying to do?" Alessio exhaled slowly. "I'm trying to be someone you're not ashamed of." The answer wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was simple. Luca looked at him differently after that. Not softer, just less guarded. One evening, as Alessio prepared to leave, Isabella walked him to the door. "You're changing," she said. He didn't take it as praise. "I'm learning." "You had to lose everything to learn." "Yes." She studied him for a moment. "I didn't raise him to hate you," she said quietly. "But I didn't raise him to depend on you either." "I know. You don't get to decide who he becomes." "I wouldn't dare." That answer mattered, because the old Alessio would have dared. He would have assumed. He would have commanded. Now he understood something profound. Being a father is not the same as being a ruler. One controls. The other earns trust. Months passed. Luca began visiting the estate occasionally, always with Isabella's approval. The first time he entered the gates, he stared at the towering iron doors. "This is where you live?" "Yes." "It's big." "It's empty," Alessio replied. Luca didn't argue. Inside, the mansion felt different with a child's footsteps echoing down the halls. The chandeliers seemed less cold, the silence less heavy. Luca didn't look impressed. He looked curious. He asked about the portraits on the walls, about Alessio's father, about the rules of the house. "Do people do what you say because they want to?" Luca asked. "Sometimes," Alessio answered. "And the other times?" "Because they're afraid." Luca nodded slowly. "I don't want people to be afraid of me." Alessio felt something tighten in his chest. "Neither do I," he said. And for the first time, he meant it. One night, after Luca and Isabella left, Alessio sat alone in his office. He stared at his father's old photograph again. For years, He had believed legacy meant bloodline. Now he understood something deeper. Legacy is behavior. It's the pattern you pass down. Fear had been passed to him, but he didn't have to pass it forward. He rolled himself toward the window and looked out over the estate. Power still surrounded him, but it no longer defined him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to own something. He was trying to deserve it. And that difference changed everything. Because hope is not built in a single apology. It is built in repetition, in patience, in choosing restraint when control is easier. And somewhere between chess matches and honest answers, a man who once believed he could take anything was finally learning how to wait. 17 years. That was how long it had taken for the Moretti mansion to feel less like a fortress and more like a house. Not because the marble floors had changed, not because the iron gates had softened, but because the silence inside it was no longer built on fear. It was built on reflection. Luca was 17 now, tall, lean, thoughtful. He no longer needed Isabella to accompany him to the estate. He arrived on his own, sometimes by bus, sometimes on the back of a friend's motorcycle that made Alessio's security team visibly nervous. Alessio never commented. Control had long stopped being his instinct. Trust had replaced it. That afternoon, Luca walked into the study without knocking. The same study where years ago, a 19-year-old girl had stood trembling with a truth no one wanted to hear. Alessio looked up from his desk. "You're early," he said. "I finished school early." There was a new weight in Luca's voice, a seriousness that hadn't been there before. Alessio noticed it immediately. "What's on your mind?" he asked. Luca didn't sit. He walked toward the large window overlooking the grounds. "I got accepted," he said. "To where?" "Law school." The words settled slowly. Alessio felt something shift in his chest. Not disappointment, not pride alone, but something deeper. "That's impressive," he said sincerely. "I'm going," Luca continued, "in another state." Silence stretched between them. The estate felt larger in that moment, the walls taller, the distance more noticeable. "You don't need my permission," Alessio said. "I know." "Then why are you telling me like that?" Luca turned around. "Because I need to know something." Alessio waited. "Are you disappointed that I don't want the empire?" The question carried no accusation, just honesty. Alessio stared at his son, at the strength in his posture, at the absence of fear in his eyes. Years ago, he would have answered differently. Years ago, he would have insisted. He would have framed legacy as duty, power as obligation. But the man sitting in the wheelchair now was not that version. "No," Alessio said quietly. "I'm relieved." Luca blinked. "Relieved?" "Yes." He rolled closer to the window, stopping beside his son. "When I was your age," he said, "I didn't think I had a choice. And now? Now I understand that forcing someone into a life they didn't choose is just another form of control." Luca studied him carefully. "You've changed." "Yes." "Because of me?" Alessio considered that. "Because I finally understood what I almost lost." That answer hung between them. Years ago, Alessio had believed an heir meant continuity of power. Now he understood something else. An heir is not someone who inherits your throne. It's someone who inherits your growth. That evening, Isabella joined them for dinner at the estate. It was the first time she had sat at the long dining table without tension in her shoulders. The chandeliers still glowed softly above them, but the room no longer felt intimidating. It felt neutral. Earned. Luca spoke about his plans, public defense work, reform, helping people who couldn't afford representation. Alessio listened without interruption, not because he had nothing to say, but because he finally understood listening was more powerful than commanding. After dinner, Isabella stepped onto the balcony for air. Alessio followed slowly. The city lights shimmered in the distance. "You raised him well," he said. "I raised him differently," she corrected. A faint smile touched his lips. "Yes." She leaned against the railing. "You didn't fight him," she said. "About law school." I wanted to, he admitted. She looked at him, surprised. But I learned something, he continued. Wanting control doesn't mean you deserve it. Isabella nodded slowly. You can't undo what happened, she said. I know. But you didn't repeat it. That was the closest she had ever come to forgiveness, and it was enough. The day Luca left for school, Alessio didn't make a spectacle. No convoy, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet goodbye in the driveway. You don't owe me visits, Alessio said. I know, Luca replied. Come back because you want to. Luca hesitated for a moment. Then he stepped forward and did something that once would have felt impossible. He hugged him, not tightly, not desperately, just enough. I'm not ashamed of you, Luca said quietly. Alessio closed his eyes for a brief second. That sentence carried more weight than any title he had ever held. After Luca left, the estate returned to quiet. But it wasn't the old kind of quiet. It wasn't silence built on fear. It was space. Space for reflection. Space for change. Alessio wheeled himself back into the study. He looked at his father's portrait one last time. Then he removed it from the wall, not out of anger, but out of decision. Legacy was no longer about repeating what he had been taught. It was about breaking it. Years later, when Luca stood in a courtroom defending someone who had never been given a fair chance, he carried something invisible with him. Not the Moretti Empire, not the weight of fear, but the lesson his father had learned too late and passed on just in time. Power without responsibility destroys everything it touches. But humility can rebuild what pride once shattered. And sometimes, the greatest legacy a father can leave behind is giving his son the freedom to become better than him. The mansion was quieter than it had ever been, not empty, just still. Evening light spilled through the tall windows of the study, stretching gold across the marble floors. Alessio sat in his wheelchair beside the same window he had once stared through on the night he decided to search for a son he had tried to erase. Time had softened him, not physically. The chair was still permanent, but in the way he carried silence. On his desk sat a newspaper clipping. Young attorney wins landmark case protecting single mothers from housing exploitation. Beneath the headline was a photo of Luca, confident, steady, unafraid, not feared, respected. A knock came at the study door. Alessio didn't need to ask who it was. Luca stepped in, older now, suit slightly wrinkled from a long day in court. You kept it, Luca said, nodding toward the clipping. So, of course. They sat together without ceremony. No empire talk, no strategy, no control. Just father and son. I used to think, Alessio said quietly, that legacy meant someone carrying your name forward. Luca looked at him. And now? Now I know it means making sure they don't carry your mistakes. Luca didn't respond right away. Then he placed a hand briefly on his father's shoulder. You gave me something better than power, he said. Alessio swallowed. What? A choice. The words settled in the room like something sacred. Outside, the iron gate stood open. Not for security, not for show. Just open. Alessio watched the sun dip below the horizon. For years, he had believed strength meant taking. Then he believed it meant surviving. Now he understood. Strength meant accountability. Strength meant breaking cycles. And strength meant choosing differently when you finally knew better. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a man who had lost everything. He felt like a man who had rebuilt something that mattered. Moral lesson to viewers: power without responsibility will always destroy what it touches. You can silence people. You can erase mistakes. You can run from consequences. But one day, life will sit you down and ask you who you chose to be. True strength isn't control. It isn't fear. It isn't dominance. It's accountability. And sometimes, the greatest redemption isn't getting everything back. It's making sure the next generation doesn't repeat your failures. You can't undo your past, but you can decide what kind of future grows from it. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, question, or even tear up, don't scroll away quietly. Like this video so more people can see stories that carry meaning. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story will challenge power in a completely different way. And tell me in the comments, do you believe everyone deserves a second chance, or are some mistakes too big to forgive? I'll see you in the next chapter.